Okay, this is lecture number 98 in the ABCs of Communism series, and we finished with the hunting and gathering Paleolithic primitive communists in the last lecture for Europe. Now we're going to move into Neolithic Europe, specifically the stage of tribal agriculture and Europe's Neolithic Revolution. Now the Neolithic or New Stone Age is the archaeological manifestation of the last primitive communist stage, which is the stage of tribal agriculture. For Europe, this stage begins by 20,000 BP in the hilly flanks of Southwest Asia. However, as we have seen in the preceding 6 volumes, every part of the Old World and the New World witnessed this transition from food collecting to food production. In the Old World, we use the term Neolithic, and in the New World, we use the term formative. Now, everywhere in the world, this stage of tribal agriculture evolves into the stage of simple chiefdoms. And everywhere in the world, this stage of simple chiefdoms evolves into the stage of advanced theocratic chiefdoms. These two stages, taken together, feature the period of transition from primitive communism into the servitude epoch. Everywhere in the world, the servitude epoch begins with the stage of chattel slavery. And everywhere in the world, the stage of chattel slavery transforms into the stage of wage slavery or capitalism. And everywhere in the world, that transformation of chattel into wage slavery occurs via a transitional socio-cultural evolutionary stage called feudalism. Now, archaeologically, the last part of the Old Stone Age or Paleolithic has special diagnostic characteristics in excavated layers called Epipaleolithic and Mesolithic. These archaeological stages are the transitional periods of the transition from broad-spectrum wild resource exploitation into the agricultural revolution. Now that agricultural revolution is what V. Gordon Childe termed the Neolithic Revolution, the sociocultural event of greatest historic import since the advent of Homo as a cultural phenomenon. Its archaeological manifestation is the New Stone Age, or Neolithic, and it begins with the experimentation in growing crops and penning animals. In a word, farming. The Neolithic is a progression from the use of wild grass seeds into their domestication as horticultural and then true agricultural crops. This was accompanied in Southwest Asia by domesticated cattle and pigs. Broad-spectrum wild resource collecting continued in fishing for smelt and freshwater, collecting shellfish and seafood along shorelines and near-shore environments where available. These beginnings of the European Neolithic matured in the Levant, for example in Jericho in the modern-day West Bank, about 12,200 to 10,800 BP. This Neolithic developed directly from the Epipaleolithic Natufian culture, whose people pioneered the use of wild cereals, which then evolved into true farming. However, as we have just seen, there was preparation for true farming all over Europe, including Western Russia, from the Urals Mountains all the way to the East European plains along the Danube River. For that matter, there was preparation in the toolkits of all of Central and Western Europe's Upper Paleolithic. The cultures had to come from somewhere, and it was from the hilly flanks of Southwest Asia that the wild predecessors of wheat, millet, oats, barley, and flax grew in profusion. Now, archaeologically, this Natufian cultural manifestation lasted from 14,500 and 11,500 BP. It is often called Proto-Neolithic and includes the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A, PPNA, dating 12,200 to 10,800 BP. As these people evolved dependence on wild cereals in their diet, the transition into relatively sedentary village agricultural life was underway. The Iraqi valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers were areas of the Neolithic Revolution after 12,000 BP. From here, some tribal agricultural people moved into the vast plains of Europe, from the Urals Mountains to the Danube River of East Europe, bringing their domesticated cultigens, sedentary village life, ground and polished stone tools, and ceramics with them. Others of their original stock chose a different path, which led them into increasing professional specialization and the development of irrigation and intensive farming. Now it's with the former branch, the people that moved into Europe, Europe, with whom we are concerned in this chapter and in this lecture. At this point, I want you to throw out everything you thought you knew about the spread of agriculture from Southwest Asia into Europe. We're going to start fresh, as the new perspective of 2018 allows us. To begin with, a snapshot of the founder. Vere Gordon Childe made the Neolithic famous. We have visited Childe before many times in these volumes, and you will recall that he was an Australian by birth and spent most of his life in the United Kingdom. There he worked as an academician for the University of Edinburgh and then the Institute of Archaeology in London. During his life, he wrote 26 books. For us, he is remembered as the first exponent of a specifically Marxist archaeology in the world, and he was the first of 3 persons to whom I dedicated my textbook, The Foundations of Archaeology. In April 1892, Childe was born in Sydney, New South Wales, to a middle-class English migrant family in Australia. He went on to study classics at the University of Sydney before moving to England to study classical archaeology at the University of Oxford. And most importantly, it was in England where he learned dialectical and historical materialism. In 1914, when the capitalists finally launched their long-awaited World War, Childe joined the anti-war campaign. As a revolutionary Marxist, he knew this war was a conflict waged by competing imperialists for redivision of world markets and resources, and along the way it was their intention to kill as much of Europe's working class as possible. In 1917, returning to Australia, he found he could not work in the academic world because of his socialism. Instead, he got a job working as the personal assistant of John Story of the Australian Labor Party. Childe became a Leninist that year, joining with the kernel of persons who would soon create the Communist Party of Great Britain. He had been watching the Bolshevik success in Russia and admiring Lenin's total opposition to the World War. Accordingly, he became very critical of Australia's Labor Party, under control of its revisionist, a Bernie Sanders kind of right-wing socialism. He had a choice in Australia, and so he left Labor and joined the industrial workers of the world. In 1921, Childe emigrated permanently to London, becoming the librarian of the Royal Anthropological Institute, and there he pursued his research into European prehistory, traveling across the continent and publishing his findings in academic papers and books. Many of his accomplishments seem common sense today. For example, in these years, it had not yet been established that there was such a thing as an archaeological culture. Childe introduced the idea that a recurring assemblage of artifacts represents a distinct cultural group of people, and he demonstrated in his first field work in the excavation of a number of archaeological sites in Scotland and Northern Ireland that there had been a Neolithic society at Orkney, specifically by excavating the settlement of Skara Brae and the chambered tombs of Marsho and Keenis. From 1927 through to 1946, he worked as the Abercrombie Professor of Archaeology at the University of Edinburgh, and then from 1947 to 1957 as the Director of the Institute of Archaeology in London. Throughout, he published prolifically, producing excavation reports, journal articles, and books. With Stuart Piggott and Graham Clark, he co-founded the Prehistoric Society in 1934, becoming its first president. All 3 of them recognized that the simultaneity of environmental change with the onset of the agricultural revolution of the Neolithic could not have been the primary cause of the Neolithic. Why? Because that environmental change had happened many previous times and did not produce agricultural society. Dialectics taught Childe that primary causation is always internal to any given phenomenon. In the case of sociocultural phenomena, internal causation primacy meant within culture, and specifically within the mode of production. In other words, people had to have evolved the ability to process wild seeds at the very least, if they were to progress to agriculture quite apart from external environmental change. Now, Childe remained a Marxist-Leninist all of his life. Accordingly, from the beginning of his academic and popularizing work, he used historical materialism, that is Marx's laws of history, as the interpretive framework for archaeological data. He was always a supporter of the Soviet Union and visited that country many times and was once received by Joseph Stalin. Accordingly, he was legally barred from entering the United States, despite being repeatedly invited to lecture by U.S. universities. In 1957, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. He wrote his own obituary and left for Australia, where he jumped off a cliff to his death. In his academic work and his popularization of prehistory in many books, Child became known as the great synthesizer of regional research into a broader picture of Near Eastern and European prehistory. His first book along these lines was published in 1925, entitled The Dawn of European Civilization. Then in 1929 he followed it up with The Most Ancient East, the Oriental Prelude to European Prehistory. And in 1935 an update of that book entitled The Most Ancient East, the Oriental Prelude to European Prehistory. This was one of his first books I read 20 years later, alongside Man Makes Himself and What Happened in History, and I recall buying all three of those in a bookstore in Salt Lake City when I was 15 years old. Now, Child followed his introduction of the concept of the Neolithic Revolution with the concept of an urban revolution that today I would place in the advanced theocratic chiefdom and early slave stage. However, in this way, he was expanding Marx's theory on sociocultural evolution. Now let's look at the spread into Europe and the Urals to the Danube of this Neolithic revolution. We know that European food-producing societies came initially from the hilly flanks of Southwest Asia at the close of the last glacial period, about 14,000 BP. As some went north through Anatolia to Russia, they encountered people already experimenting with horticulture. Other Southwest Asians went south along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. All developed into a number of regionally distinctive cultures by 10,000 BP. Some of the northerly wave of food-producing societies branched into the islands of the Aegean. We know from radiocarbon that they arrived in these Aegean islands before 8500 BP. In particular, we have evidence from archaeological sites at Knossos, Franthi Cave, and a number of mainland sites in Thessaly. Neolithic groups appear soon after in the Balkans and south-central Europe. These Neolithic cultures of southeastern Europe prove this continuity with groups in southwest Asia and Anatolia, for example at the site of Karakoyuk. Now, Neolithic sites in Europe contain ceramics and remains of plants and animals domesticated in southwest Asia. The inventory includes wheat, emmer, barley, lentils, pigs, goats, sheep, and cattle. The only domesticate not from southwest Asia was broom corn millet, and that was domesticated in East Asia. The earliest evidence of cheese making dates to 7500 BP in Kujawim, Poland. This early European Neolithic culture was homogeneous. Subsequent diffusion across Europe from the Aegean to Britain took about 2,500 years, that is from 8,500 to 6,000 BP. The Baltic region came a bit later, around 5,500 BP, and there was a delay in settling the Pannonian Plain. The Neolithic newcomers advanced from one patch of fertile alluvial soil to another, bypassing mountainous areas. Analysis of radiocarbon dates shows that indigenous Epipaleolithic and Mesolithic cultures lived side by side with Neolithic Southwest Asian interlopers for 1,000 years in many parts of Europe. This was especially the case on the Iberian Peninsula and along the Atlantic coast. Population levels rose rapidly at the beginning of the Neolithic until they reached the carrying capacity. This was followed by a population crash of enormous magnitude after 7,000 BP, with levels remaining low during the next 1,500 years. Population began to rise again after 5,500 BP, with vicissitudes between 5,000 and 4,500 BP between regions. A study of 12 European regions found most experienced boom and bust patterns were endogenous in causality and not climatic. European Neolithic groups share basic characteristics such as living in small family farm-based villages. These farmers grew domesticated plants and kept penned animals. This diet was supplemented with a collection of wild plant foods. Fishing and hunting, food was prepared and stored in handmade pottery without using a potter's wheel. Ground stones, tools for cereals, and polished stone axes enabled forest clearance for agriculture and cutting and shaping wood for dwellings and for fuel. Now there is a transformational archetype at the site of Lipinski Vir. Archaeological evidence of human habitation of Serbian caves dates back to around 22,000 BP. The first settlement on the low plateau dates back to 11,500 to 9,200 BP at a time when the climate was warmer. Lipinski Vir in Serbia begins as an Epipaleolithic Mesolithic site dated from 11,500 BP. Occupation there continues through the Neolithic from 8,300 to 8,000 BP. The Lipinski Vir site consists of one large settlement with around 10 satellite villages. That Neolithic represents a tribal agricultural stage farming community evolving in its later manifestations into simple chiefdoms, and then the ATC stage transitional societies. The urban ATC in the 8,300 to 8,000 BP period featured trapezoidal buildings and monumental sculpture and was planned to be a permanent city. The main site consists of several archaeological phases, starting with tribal agriculturalist descendants of hunting and gathering people in the Proto-Lipinski Vir phase. Then, following the phases Lipinski Vir 1A through E, Lipinski Vir 2, and Lipinski Vir 3, spanning 1,500 to 2,000 years ago, representing simple and eventually advanced theocratic chiefdoms. A number of satellite villages belonging to the same culture and time period were discovered in the surrounding area, and these sites include Hajduka, Vodenica, Padina, Vlasak, Icona, and Kladovska Skila. Associated artifacts include stone and bone tools, the remains of houses, and numerous ceremonial objects, including unique stone sculptures. The Vinca succeeded the Lipinski Vir advanced theocratic chiefdom, being 84 miles upstream on the Danube, and the Starchevo ATC 86 miles from Lipinski Vir. These hunter-gatherers inhabited the area when a new population began to settle the Balkans and the Danube Valley. Genetic evidence proves these Neolithic newcomers intermarried with them, so that the blending of the population occurred almost immediately during the first immigrant generation. In other parts of Europe, two such different communities would live next to each other for several generations. Anyway, the interlopers brought agriculture in the form of first grain crops and animal husbandry. Imported were sheep, cattle, and goats. The new intermarried population created the Lipinski Vir culture. In so doing, they established the original Balkan Neolithic. The tribal agriculturalists and simple chieftain peoples then spread over the continent of Europe, some creating along the way advanced theocratic chiefdoms. Now back at the ranch at Treskovac is a bare porphyritic cliff 2,228 feet high, rising on the left bank of the Danube opposite Lipinski Vir, standing like a giant sentinel of the prehistoric settlement. It was very important to the ideology of the inhabitants of Lipinski Vir. The site sat on a narrow plateau along the banks of the river, squeezed between the cliffs and the Danube River. Findings from the earliest layer, Proto-Lipinski Vir, show limited natural resources in the immediate area, but it gave security and unlimited fresh water for people, but they had to travel to gather and collect a broad spectrum of resources other than those obtained from fishing. Accordingly, Proto-Lipinski Vir was a small settlement of 4 or 5 families with fewer than 100 people. The Lipinski Vir population expanded in the 1A through 1E settlement phase. The challenge presented by their locale led to a planned village of the simple chiefdom variety. All houses were built following one complex geometric pattern conforming to the peculiar topography. These house remains constitute the distinct Lipinski Vir architecture. Dead commoners were buried outside the village in an elaborate cemetery. A few tribal council elders and later chiefs were buried behind the fireplaces in their homes. As the Lipinski-Veer simple chiefdom evolved to the ATC stage, it featured the diagnostic ranked social structure dominated by a true religion. As in all ATCs, that religion served as the binding force for the community. The earlier shamans had become true professional priests. They preached giving sufficient authority to the center for the effective coordination of its members' productive labor. Numerous sacred objects discovered in layers 1 to 3 support this hypothesis, including Piscean sculptures unique to the Lipinski-Veer culture. Lipinski-Veer gives us another opportunity to observe the gradual transition from the hunter-gatherer way of life to the agricultural economy of the Neolithic. At any rate, once agricultural products were commoditized, a new way of life replaced the old social structure. The Vinca. In 1908, Serbian archaeologist Miloš Vesic discovered a prehistoric settlement at Belo Brdo Hill close to the village of Vinca, a site located 9 miles downstream of Belgrade on the right bank of the Danube River. This Neolithic archaeological culture was named the Vinca culture after the first excavation site, and additional sites are found in Serbia and in neighboring countries. Many differences evolved within the Serbian region of Neolithic communities as people passed from tribal agriculturalism to simple chiefdoms and then became ATCs. In Southeastern Europe, these ATC people often lived in heavily fortified chiefdom settlements of 3,000 to 4,000 people, for example at Sesklo in Greece. This is in contrast to Neolithic groups in Britain that were small tribal agriculturalists of 50 to 100 people with mobile cattle herding. At its peak, the Vinca culture along the banks of the Danube featured major advances in writing and farming. The first writing system anywhere in Europe was created in the Vinca culture with about 700 characters and symbols, mainly carved in pottery goods. I think this is evidence that the simple chiefdoms of the area from the Urals Mountains to the Danube had evolved into their advanced theocratic stage, or at least some of them had. The Vinca culture advances in writing, farming, and copper metallurgy are the proof. Now this culture began as a simple chiefdom by 7,800 years ago. Within 2 centuries it evolved into an ATC, and that stage lasted 1,000 years. Eventually it collapsed as ranks became classes, and class war destroyed most settlements, while others were simply abandoned as farmers and professionals fled. The people of the Vinca Danube lived in permanent settlements numbering as many as a few thousands of people. Houses were made of clay wattle and daub construction, built on a foundation of stones and gravel, and sometimes mixed with mortar. The use of domesticated animals and the cultivation of crops were ubiquitous. The Vinca developed cereal agriculture of wheats, oats, and barley. A cattle-drawn plow was used to prepare the soil. In addition to farming, villagers relied on hunting, fishing, and foraging for sources of food. Weaving textiles was common in the Vinca culture, with flax as the main raw material, though nettle and wool were used. Small weights found at some excavation sites give evidence that vertical loom weaving was used. Small weights made of clay and marked with signs or a number were placed at the ends to weigh down threads. This technology is diagnostic of the ATC stage, as is the high degree of professional specialization of labor, shown in the highly sophisticated Vinca pottery kilns with firing temperatures up to 1,000 degrees centigrade. These kilns produced kitchenware such as plates, cups, bowls, pots, and other vessels, as well as high-quality fine ceramics, probably for the upper ranks and eventually ruling classes. Most ceramics were decorated, and especially on the fine ritual pieces, signs and symbols were engraved, sometimes as seals and as a type of writing. Many female figurines, figures of males and animals, as well as vases, amulets, and various altars, were found in the excavation. Strange hybrid figurines, such as female statuettes with bird faces, are typical Vinca. Evidence shows that the Vinca people used copper vessels and other copper items, proving copper metallurgy 1,000 years before it appeared in Central Europe. At that time, copper ore was found in the Balkan Mountains and in the Carpathians. Evidence of copper smelting was found southeast of Belgrade at the excavation sites of Runda Glava and Belovodi, where Vinca culture was the most highly developed culture in the southeast of Europe. Other ATC cultures existed in neighboring regions with many shared influences. North of the Vinca were the Lengyel and the Tisa cultures. In the east was the Karanova culture, and the Hamangia, Cernovoda, and the Varna cultures were situated close to the coast of the Black Sea. At a necropolis near the city of Varna, many golden artifacts were found. This Varna gold treasure was made between 6500 and 6400 BP and is the oldest known goldsmithy in Europe. The ATC Cucuteni culture was prevalent in the Carpathian Mountains and further northeast in the Siret and Prut river basins. The Cucuteni ATC featured huge urban settlements with populations of up to 10,000 people. The Cucuteni ATC developed a little later than the Vinca and is the logical conclusion of the rank-to-class transformation. The Vinca ATC vanished nearly 6,200 years ago from class war. Now, the village of Starchevo, the type site, is located on the north bank of the Danube in Serbia, in Vojvodina province, opposite Belgrade. It represents the earliest settled farming society in the area, although hunting and gathering still provided a significant portion of the inhabitants' diet. The Starchevo culture was part of a larger grouping known as the Starchevo-Koros-Kris culture in southeastern Europe, dating between 8200 and 6500 BP, when a type of bone spatula, perhaps for scooping flour, is a distinctive artifact. The pottery is initially coarse, but as tribal agriculture gave way to simple and then advanced theocratic chiefdom stage society, finer fluted and painted vessels emerged. The Koros is a similar culture in Hungary, named after the river Koros, with a closely related culture that used footed vessels and some painted ones. Both Starchevo and Koros have given their names to the wider culture of the region in that period. The Starchevo culture covered an area including present-day Serbia and Montenegro, as well as parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Croatia, Hungary, the Republic of Macedonia, and Romania. There are temporarily parallel and closely related societies of the Karanovo culture in Bulgaria, the Kris in Romania, and the Prisesklo in Greece. The westernmost locality of this culture can be found in Croatia near Zrvlovi, and that is part of the town of Jolofar. This Croatian archaeological manifestation was the final stage of the culture. Findings from Zrvlovi belong to the regional subtype of the final variant in the long process of Neolithic socio-evolution called the Zrvlovi facies of the Starchevo culture. And then we have the end of the Neolithic period in southeastern Europe. The area of the Carpathian Basin south to the Thessalian Plain includes the modern-day countries of Hungary, Romania, the former Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Albania, Macedonia, and northern Greece. This region is a relatively cohesive geographic unit, bounded on the north and west by the Austrian and Slovakian Alps. On the east, the Carpathian Mountains bound the area. The geographic layout has several small, discrete microregions, each with its own set of local resources, and this variation produced differentiation among the farming societies of the area at the end of the Neolithic period. The phases in southeastern Europe include a formal Copper Stone Age, that is, Chalcolithic, that started throughout the region by 6500 BP. In Greece, where the Bronze Age began slightly earlier than it did farther north in the Balkans and in the Carpathian Basin, it is called the Final Neolithic. It dates from 6500 to 5300 BP. In the Central Balkans, that is in Bulgaria, Macedonia, and Albania, it runs from about 6500 to 5000 BP and is labeled the E-Neolithic. And in the former Yugoslavia, the same time period is called the E-Neolithic or the Chalcolithic, and in Hungary and western Romania, it is termed the Copper Age. The ending phases are defined by a dramatic increase in the exploitation of copper as a raw material source for producing artifacts. As detailed knowledge of the region grew from excavations and more precise dating, it has become clear that the use of copper began in several parts of the region during the Neolithic. The earliest copper use focused on the production of beads, hooks, and decorative trinkets by hammering pure copper. By the 5th millennium BC, copper use expanded to much larger artifacts. These items include adzes and axes made from the mining of copper-bearing material, such as malachite. Then the copper was smelted from the core and poured into prepared molds to make tools. Thus, the Copper Age is now recognized as the period that saw a dramatic increase in the level of copper production and the concomitant widespread use of smelting to make big cast tools. More precisely, the Copper Age is seen as the period when societies throughout Europe, Eastern Europe, underwent dramatic changes in economic and social organization. That is, advanced theocratic chiefdoms transformed into the class-divided, state-organized societies of the Bronze Age. Now, the late Neolithic culture areas. During the late Neolithic in Southeastern Europe, settlements were occupied and reoccupied for thousands of years. This frequent reoccupation resulted in the formation of stratigraphically superimposed habitation layers that grew several meters high. These types of sites, commonly called tells, are typical of the period, but not the only kinds of settlement in the region. One synthesis of the late Neolithic in eastern Hungary, entitled The Late Neolithic of the Tisa region by Nandor Kalietz and Pal Raksky, divides late Neolithic site types into three categories. 1. Formal tell settlements, 2. Tell-like mounds, and 3. Flat settlements. This classification conveniently separates vertical stratigraphic layers into analytical units. Now, there is a late Neolithic crystallization of a discretely defined regional groups distinguished by their ceramic assemblages. In Eastern Europe, these distinctions extend to settlement organizations and subsistence practices. Large-scale regional homogeneity is diagnostic of the early Neolithic by contrast. Those had very similar house forms, ceramic traditions, and the settlement layout extended over very large geographic areas. The Thessalian plain in northern Greece had substantial occupation throughout the Neolithic. It witnessed the development of tell sites earlier than the northern Balkans. The late Neolithic there is known from the extensive excavations at the site of Dimini, dating to the end of the 6th millennium BC. Habitation continued at other sites such as Sesklo, where a tell has been established by the end of the early Neolithic. New sites also began to appear in fresh areas, such as Sitigroi in Thrace. North of Greece, in south-central Bulgaria, the Karanovo tell shows occupation levels dating to the beginning of the 6th millennium BC. As we have seen, it has been the main site through which all relative regional stratigraphic sequences have been established, and throughout the 20th century, archaeologists used the 40 feet of cultural occupation layers at Karanovo to link internal facing relationships in Southeast Europe and to develop the relationship of the phases in Southeast Europe relative to those in Anatolia and further east. The stratigraphic layers at the Karanovo tell have been divided into 6 major levels. The earliest phases, 1 through 3, correspond to the early and middle Neolithic of the region. Phases 4 and 5 conform to the late Neolithic. Phase 6 to the early Copper Age. Findings at other multi-phase, multi-component tell sites in the region, such as Asbak, just to the west of Karanovo, suggest successive, probably continuous, reoccupation throughout the Neolithic. Farther north, in northern Serbia, the Vinca tell was occupied from the middle Neolithic through the beginning of the Copper Age, and there the stratigraphic levels have been divided into 4 main phases, as we have seen. To recapitulate, the level A corresponds more or less to the middle Neolithic, and levels B and C to the late Neolithic. Level D is associated with the early Copper Age. This Vinca culture extended over most of Serbia and parts of Bosnia and Croatia and into the Banat region of southwestern Romania. As in northern Greece, Macedonia, and parts of Bulgaria, more sites were established in regions that previously had been sparsely inhabited. In the Carpathian Basin, there were two cultural trajectories. The Middle Neolithic linear pottery culture developed on either side of the Danube River by about 7000 BP. In the Eastern Basin, in the area known as the Great Hungarian Plain, late Neolithic societies along the Tisa River separated. They gave rise to smaller regional cultural groups called Tisa, Herpoli, and Sochalam that were distributed into different regions of the plain. This subdivision of the plain into three discrete cultural groups evolved continuously throughout the late Neolithic. West of the Danube, in Transdanubia, late Neolithic settlements are assigned to the earlier phases of the Lengyel culture, that is, Lengyel I and II. In the eastern Carpathian Basin, there is an abrupt break in the cultural sequence between the late Neolithic Tisa Herpali Sochalam complex and the succeeding early Copper Age Tisa Bulgar culture. Now, sites in the Lengyel culture exhibit more continuity into the Copper Age, as in Lengyel III. The societies east of the Danube witnessed an abrupt transformation affecting several aspects of their social organization at the beginning of the Copper Age around 6500 BP. Those societies to the west of the Danube took longer to acquire the social characteristics associated with the Copper Age. Now, as to the mode of production, late Neolithic groups continued the generalized farming, herding, hunting, fishing, and gathering established earlier. However, these late Neolithic societies relied first on domesticated plants and animals, used at the earliest Neolithic sites in southeastern Europe. Their principal domestic plants were varieties of wheat and barley, with lentils, bitter vetch, chickpeas, and flax occurring in lesser quantities. The main domestic animals were cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. During the late Neolithic, these animals were used for meat rather than for milk, cheese, and other secondary products. Now, while the late Neolithic villagers of Southeast Europe relied predominantly upon these domestic resources for subsistence, they continued to make use of wild resources available in the local environment, and these included roe deer, red deer, and wild boar, as well as smaller mammals such as rabbits. In addition, they fished and caught birds. Emmer and einkorn wheat, as well as hulled barley, was grown in Southeast Europe's late Neolithic. Beans, peas, lentils, and pulse legumes, supplementing a diet of cereals, simultaneously increased the nitrogen content of the soil. In northern Greece and late Neolithic at Sesklo, emmer wheat prevailed, and einkorn was found in substantial quantities. In the Sesklo late Neolithic are remains of wild figs, grapevines, almonds, and oats. Now, emmer wheat has been found in the botanical remains from the late Neolithic Dimini, along with einkorn wheat, 6-row barley, naked barley, lentils, peas, fava beans, bitter vetch, chickpeas, grass peas, and wild grapevines and almonds. Similar botanical remains have been recovered from the late Neolithic at Karanovo in Bulgaria, Ansa in Macedonia, Obre in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Gomulova in Serbia. In the central and northern Balkans and in the Hungarian plain, wild apples also occur in small numbers. Protein from wild animals was obtained harking back to the earliest Neolithic in the region. Inhabitants of the southern Balkans kept more sheep and goats during the late Neolithic than did the villagers of the northern Balkans and the Carpathian Basin, where more cattle were exploited. For example, 50 to 85% of the bones and faunal assemblages at sites in northern Serbia, southwestern Romania, and eastern Hungary represent domestic animals, the vast majority of which are cattle. Throughout the Neolithic assemblages in northern Greece, by contrast, there are many more domestic animals, primarily sheep and goats. Now, the increased number of cattle in the northern Balkans at the end of the Neolithic was for their primary products, meat, fur, and bone. However, Coming into the economic picture are their secondary products, milk, cheese, and the animals themselves for plowing. This secondary products revolution, a term coined by Andrew Sherratt, has implications for the developing Neolithic economic systems in prehistoric Europe. Within early and middle Neolithic settlements, most socio-economic activities, from farming to pottery making, were conducted by the members of individual farming households. These early to middle Neolithic agriculturalists were the stage of tribal agriculture and then simple chiefdoms. Marshall Solons calls this pattern the domestic mode of production, or DMP. Within these kinds of farm households, social status and intergroup influence comes from the ability of each leader in earning that status. By the late Neolithic, as these farmers were moving into the ATC stage, the DMP was still important, although certain archaeological diagnostics show a rapid increase in the professional specialization of labor, for example, utilitarian ceramics. The evidence for social ranking in the period comes from this professional specialization of labor, the village layout patterns, and the organization of burial practices. By ATC times, all three of these things show complex, structured social relationships. At Dimini in northern Greece, there are groups of houses arranged around courtyards, proving that society was subdivided into units of social rank. A similar pattern is evident at the massive 60-acre site of Makrialos, where several large rectangular buildings were constructed, serving as gathering places for the population, and farther north at Selivac and at the smaller site of Davostin, Phase 2 in Serbia, the distribution of houses proves that society was divided into ranked social units. In eastern Hungary, at Polgár-Zsálom on the Upper Tisza, is a large site with a multi-ditched mound called a rondel. It is located at the western edge of a very large horizontal settlement. At least 5 ditches and palisades enclosed an area of about 590 feet in diameter, with 15 burned houses at the center. The floor of one building, House 9, yielded an assemblage of miniature statuettes, clay sun discs, and footed bowls. Another pit contained 259 copper bead fragments, copper wire fragments, and bone tubes. The ash dirt fill surrounding the disarticulated copper and bone artifacts was a sacrificial pit, and the central area of the rondel was a sacred sanctuary. Alongside the rondel, running roughly east and west, was a horizontal settlement covering an area of 36 acres, with several timber-framed long houses measuring 8 to 12 by 4.5 by 4 to 5 meters, organized into compounds that contain cylindrical wells and small clusters of graves. The settlement is divided internally into discrete, independent social units. The rondel features suggest that this side, as in other tales on the Hungarian plain, functioned as a regional economic and religious center. Throughout the early Neolithic period, burials cluster in and around settlements in small groups of ethnic social units. Cremation burials at Dimini, dating to the late 8th millennium BP, have been found under floors and near hearths. Primary and secondary burials were discovered in ditches that surrounded the site of Makrialos in Macedonia. In middle to late Neolithic settlements, ranked cemetery burials replace household burials. The early 7th millennium BP at Gomolova, that is Vinca culture, has 30 people, mostly males, buried in an unused part of the settlement. To the north, on the Great Hungarian Plain, burials also occur around the settlements at tell sites, such as on the rondel at Polgár-Zsálom and at Hodzmes-Varsley Gorsa. At another site, and at Veszmagor, burials are found at horizontal settlements, such as the flat settlement at Polgár-Zsálom and Oxyd-Kofer-Shalom. Late Neolithic tells were enclosed by ditches and walls as fortifications for defense, separating them from their surroundings. These took a lot of time to build to make them durable and long-lasting. Makrialos in western Macedonia had 3 concentric ditches, Later sites in the lower Danube, such as Polyanica and Ovcharovo, had a single surrounding wall. Farther north in the Great Hungarian Plain, the settlement Pogar-Sholom had its fortified rondel, as did the Lengyel sites in Transdanubia. And there are two more sites that feature rebuilding sequences of large ditches as they expanded. These Neolithic tills were reoccupied for hundreds or thousands of years, and in that time served ceremonial and economic functions, and they were gathering places for social interaction among different settlements. At the beginning of the Copper Age, around 6500 BP, there were mode of production changes from the Carpathian Basin to the Aegean Sea. These included an increase in the production and distribution of smelted tools with larger homogeneous stylistic cultural areas. This was an economic feature of the advanced theocratic chiefdom stage, as was the altered settlement pattern with its fortified center and outlying small, numerous villages. Accompanying were formal cemeteries. The ATCs featured long-distance trade networks throughout the region. The secondary products revolution became well established as a concomitant, and in northern Greece the final Neolithic period extended from 6500 BP to 5300 BP, evolving smoothly into the early Bronze Age. This illustrates archaeologically the socio-cultural transformation from ATC-ranked society to that of class-divided, state-organized kingdom society. Accordingly, throughout northern Greece, there is a decrease in the number of habitation sites as each kingdom consolidated. This trend continued with the occupation of the Citigroi, Phase 3, and the construction of large surrounding walls at Pevkakia and Mandelo. In Bulgaria, the early Chalcolithic corresponds with level 6 at the Karanovo Tell. There, as in eastern Hungary, there was an increase in the number of sites because of an increase in specialty villages. During the 6th millennium BP, in south-central and northeast Bulgaria, there was an overall decline in the number of sites, as in southern Romania. There, the Gomenia culture is diagnostic until about 6000 BP. The transition continues with the Krivodol-Sakwa complex and the Cernovoda culture, ending in about 5000 BP. Throughout most of the former Yugoslavia, the time period from about 6500 to 5800 BP is associated with level D at Vinca, and then with the Bunaj Hum culture. In northernmost Serbia, western Romania, and eastern Hungary, from 6500 to 5800 BP, the Tisa-Polgar culture evolved into the Bodro-Kerts culture. Throughout the western Balkans, the Carpathian Basin and westward, the Baden culture extended over a large region at the end of the Copper Age by 5300 BP. The western half of the Carpathian Basin experienced a much less drastic break from the late Neolithic, with Lengyel culture, Lengyel III, settlement sites exhibiting a great deal of continuity throughout the early Copper Age. After about 6000 BP, sites in Transdanubia show a relationship to the Balaton-Lasinja culture complex. The mode of production was undergoing changes that account for this variation in settlement pattern after 6000 BP, namely, these were the widespread use of copper as the source of raw material choice source for producing much more massive tools, and the secondary products revolution, where articles of production entered the trade economy. The quantity of production increases significantly after 6000 BP. Large copper tools appeared slightly earlier in Bulgaria, toward the end of the 7th millennium BP, while copper mines definitively dated to this period are known from Bulgaria, eastern Serbia, and Thrace. The Selavac site in Serbia proves that during the late Neolithic, copper smelting occurred in households, but by the end of the Copper Age, Vucedol in Croatia had a professionally specialized industrial level of production. In northern Greece, throughout most of the Central Balkans, significant continuity is evident on settlements from the late Neolithic into the early Copper Age. In the early eastern Carpathian Basin, Copper Age settlements are only an acre in size. Without exception, the Copper Age stratigraphic levels on tell sites are separated from those of the late Neolithic by buried soil horizons that indicate a hiatus in occupation. During the 6th millennium BP, the majority of tills were abandoned, including most of those in Bulgaria and southern Romania. On the Great Hungarian Plain, site numbers decreased in the Middle Copper Age, the Bodro-Karacur culture, for example, and the Late Copper Age. The 7th millennium BP witnessed the first formal, freestanding cemeteries in southeastern Europe, rather than in farmhouses, as typified the Neolithic. The transition to independent cemeteries is a diagnostic of the early Copper Age, when cemeteries served the inhabitants of several different villages. This shift happens in the eastern Carpathian Basin by 6500 BP, and slightly earlier in northern Bulgaria, at the beginning of the 7th millennium BP. In northern Greece, a formal cemetery containing cremation burials was built several hundred yards from the Tell settlement of Platia Magula Zarku later in the 7th millennium BP. In the lower Danube, large cemeteries associated with the Hamangia culture, such as the Seravoda and the Durankulac, contain hundreds of burials dating to the beginning of the 7th millennium BP. Cemeteries in northeastern Bulgaria, such as Varna, and on the Great Hungarian Plain, such as Tisa-Polgar, Wasatanya, are not connected with settlement sites. The establishment of formal cemeteries continued throughout the Copper Age. On the Great Hungarian Plain, during the later 6th millennium BP, people of the Baden culture were buried with cattle, as at the large cemeteries of Alsunamedi and Budakalas. At the end of the 6th millennium, a new form of burial under large mounds of earth, called kurgans, are common in the northern part of southeastern Europe from the lower Danube to the Carpathian Basin. These burials have earlier parallels in the east, in Moldova and the Ukraine. The kurgan burials of the late Copper Age have parallels to the east. The 1. Abandonment of tell sites, 2. The founding of formal cemeteries, and 3. The secondary products revolution mark the end of the Neolithic in southeastern Europe. These changes at the end of the Neolithic in southeastern Europe mark the termination of the advanced theocratic chiefdom stage and the introduction of the Bronze Age, with its ranks having developed into social classes, with the state, that is the army and the police, in the hands of the ruling classes. And that brings us to a conclusion of this chapter on the Neolithic of Eastern Europe. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about the road to Iberia for the Neolithic Revolution.